Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kelly Kiedis-Ogborn. I am Vice President of Space Commerce and Entrepreneurship at Space Foundation, and we're so thrilled to have you join us today. What a wonderful turnout as we discuss the observations, trends, and what's really moving the future of the space economy forward, all of which are highlighted in our newly released space report. At Space Foundation, we often say that there has never been a better time to become part of the global space economy. This ecosystem has created new channels for commerce to flow and for business to be done. And it really is the pioneering home to new products, services, and observations that are redefining critical infrastructure while creating new jobs and innovations that are impacting more people than ever before. In fact, the current global space economy is roughly 55% higher than just a decade ago. And while we continue to observe this upward trend, the parameters have also been expanded, diversified by new players, technology, and investment. But to truly understand the undercurrent of the space economy, we need to get fairly nuanced, and we need to discuss the themes that are driving it, whether it be workforce, market influences, or investment. I know that is a very big job, but our panelists are more than open to the task. I am very thrilled to be joined on stage today by 3 experts who are also contributors to the newly released space report, who are going to share their insights with us today. Joining me on stage is Brendan Rousseau, who is a teaching fellow and research associate at Harvard Business School, Mariel Borowitz, who is Associate Professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. Her research focuses on international space policy issues, including international cooperation in Earth-observing satellites, satellite data sharing policies, and space security issues. And last is Justin Cadman, who is a partner at Quilty Analytics and has more than 15 years of investment banking and capital markets experience. Thank you so much for joining me today. A few rules of engagement before we begin. Please make sure that your cell phones are silenced. You're more than welcome to take photos, but please keep them on silent. Also, if you have any questions for the panelists, the phone number is also on the handouts. So please be sure to text that, and we'll make sure to get your numbers in queue, your questions in queue. And then lastly, I have to do a plug for us internally. There's a QR code also on the handout. We just unveiled a new Symposium 365 site where content like this and others will be involved. You can also find space report content there. So for the discussion today, a bit rules of engagement. We have 25 minutes of discussion together, and then there's going to be 15 minutes of moderated Q&A through Leslie Kahn. So let's jump right into it. My first question is for Mariel. And we're going to discuss a bit of the workforce issues. So last year, there were more than 201,000 individuals in key sectors across the US space economy, which was a slight increase from the previous year. And this sector has also proved to be resilient against the negative effects of COVID-19. And we're really seeing opportunities continue to grow both in the civil and private job sector, which is a great news story for us. Can you please speak to some of the key trends you've seen and how they influence the workforce of the future?
Sure. So just like we're seeing the space sector grow in general, we're seeing that reflected in the workforce numbers also. So as you mentioned, since about 2016, we've seen steady growth in private sector employment in the space sector. We also are seeing growth, a little bit of growth at NASA, and then of course Space Force bringing itself up to its full strength. So I think really across all the different parts of the space sector in the United States, we are seeing that growth that's really reflecting what's happening in the sector in terms of entrepreneurship and new activity as well.
And there's also been some growth diversified across the states as well, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at the private sector employment, there actually are some space employees in all 50 states, so it really is spread out. Of course, you still see the big powerhouse states come up, so Florida and Texas, California kind of leading that charge. But it really is starting to spread out to other places as well. So right here in Colorado, of course, Washington State, Virginia, a number of other states that are really making strategic investments and plans to really continue to grow that space sector in their states and kind of benefit from the coordination with new private investment and what already exists from the government.
The workforce conversation is an interesting one because while we see growth and we hear about these great statistics, there's also a lot of talk about barriers of entry and perception of the workforce, and especially an aging workforce. I think I read an interesting statistic lately that a lot of NASA's, or some of NASA's workforce, waited to retire until the successful launch of Artemis 1, and they started to see this somewhat exodus. So there is this ebb and flow of workers coming in. So to Mariel and to some of the other panelists, what are some of the barriers of entry you've seen, and how can companies really attract and retain new talent?
Yeah, that's a good question. So certainly we do have, and for NASA we have very good data on this, certainly is an aging workforce. It's something that they have been proactive about trying to manage and trying to spread that out a little bit better, but it is still a challenge that NASA and the sector as a whole have to deal with. I think space sector benefits from the fact that it is an exciting sector to join, and there is a lot of really interesting new areas where students can get involved, and young professionals. And so I think it benefits from that, but still trying to find the right mix of the skill sets that the companies need, getting that matched up with the students who are just coming out, or for the young professionals ready to join the sector. I think can be some challenges there.
And Brendan, I know you do some of this work at Harvard. Do you have any comments on barriers of entry?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and great to be with you guys. I'd say the challenge that we face the most is a lot of our students, they are MBAs, so they come from business backgrounds. A lot of them are super excited about space, have great technical skills. They've spent years at Google or Twitter. They can code like anyone, and they have a challenge of seeing where they fit in with the space industry if they don't have the exact kind of background that they feel like they should have. So from their side, it's giving them the confidence that, hey, this industry needs you, and actually I think the space industry has a ton to offer, even in contrast to the tech industry. I think a lot of people are leaving tech because they want to feel like they're spending their time and energy on something that's worth doing, and it's a pretty easy pitch for someone in my shoes saying, hey, if you want to make the world a better place, the space industry is a pretty great way to do that. So that's the opportunity, but still there is a little bit of a challenge for people who come from non-traditional backgrounds, who aren't aerospace engineers. I'd love to be able to have a list of open recs where I can say this is where we want to put you guys.
Yeah, it's interesting, and a lot of work that I do with these, I call them space adjacent industries, but industries that want to get involved, I find that some people self-select out before they realize their place within it, and that's why conversations like this are extremely important to not only illuminate the opportunities, but also show people there is a path and where that path insertion point is, because sometimes it's not obvious. But the future really does require every background, skill set, industry. And Brendan, this actually leads me to the next point that I have for you. So the global space economy, by the last count, was $469 billion. And we will be putting out a new space economy number coming in July. And that breakdown of 469 is roughly 77% commercial revenue and 23% global government spending. So it is a significant divergence, and public interest is up, opportunity is ripe, but oftentimes what is missing is this practical framework and this way of thinking about the space economy. I think as an industry, we talk to ourselves, we talk in statistics, we talk about technological viability, economic capacity, but for some folks, they don't know what that means and how to actually get involved. And so I know this is a lot of the work that you do at Harvard Business School. So I'm curious if you could share your framework of thinking of how you help people scale into space.
Sure, absolutely. I think one of the great things that we've seen is there's so much interest and excitement around space. One thing that we would like to provide to the industry to be helpful to everyone in this room is an economic framework for thinking about how do you create a space economy that is powerful and unleash market forces and make it more similar to other economies and how they operate. And then as you create that market, how do you refine it, fix market inefficiencies and market failures as they arise, and then lastly, how do you make sure that this economic engine, hopefully that we've unleashed in space, is one that is compatible with society's moral and ethical judgment. So we think a lot about that. We write a lot about it, and if you're interested in the framework we're working on, feel free to talk to me later, or we've got some articles on that.
Well, I know a lot of your work also focuses on the pros and cons, mostly the pros of a decentralized economy and marketplace, and especially as we move toward the future, there has to be a balance of competition and collaboration, quite frankly. What kind of thought process do you put into that when you talk to these businesses?
Oh man. Well, we think that competition is a good thing, and I think a lot of the reason why we're also excited about space is because of the great way that the United States government has been able to enable competition in this sector. But I think that we would all agree there's a lot more work to do. As we have created, a robust launch industry and are looking to do commercial LEO destinations and beyond, I think we're going to have a lot of, decentralization to go, and there's a lot of problems that people face. So some of the ones that we talk about are, for a lot of business cases to close, there's a lot of chicken and egg problems where people need to coordinate or talk to their competition to make sure, hey, we need you to be successful for us to be successful, and then there's a million other things as well. One, I'll throw a little tease out here. One idea that we're really excited about is called the Le Chatelier principle, which is essentially as you change inputs for a specific industry or sub-industry, it takes time for them to adjust to it in the long run. So when we look at the Earth observation market and some of the projections around that, we actually are more bullish on how the broader industry will adapt over time because you gotta take those factors in the long run. So anyway, that's just one of the things that we think about.
Well, and I imagine that also plays into a lot of the regulation, because there's regulation issues that we can expect now, and there's regulation issues that we know are going to happen. But thinking about that, and I know that probably plays into workforce and the investment world as well. Does anyone care to comment on the regulatory environment?
Yeah, so I would say, I think that's definitely right, that the way the government kind of adapts to these new technologies and new possibilities, how quickly they can allow that and allow that to flourish is really important. I would say I think it also ties to workforce in the sense of the new skill sets that you need, right? So I think Earth observation data, remote sensing data is a great example where we can collect the data, but now we're getting more and more people with the capability to actually use that data and know how to turn that into actual products and information that's going to answer a question someone cares about. And that's where you start to, I think, really see things take off. So yeah, completely agree on the workforce side as well.
Yeah, and I think some of this also speaks to the professionalization of the space industry as a discipline or as a business discipline. So historically, going back a decade or so, when I would be speaking to an entrepreneur looking to get into space or involved in space, the focus was always on, I want to build something cool, I want to do something. It was all about that end game. It wasn't about, is there a market, is there a customer, is there a demand for this thing that I'm doing? And I'm starting to see that really evolving and changing, and I think the Earth observation sector is actually a prime example of that, where there's a lot of innovation, and that innovation is no longer sort of strictly build it and they will come, but now it's actually driven by real use cases, real needs, both on the commercial side and on the defense and national security side of things.
The Earth observation world has been one of the ones that I've seen has been bringing in the most new talent. And primarily what I find interesting about that, and a data point that I always talk about when people talk about or think about space, is that 95% of the ROI in space is actually the space to Earth market, as you guys know, which a lot of people don't realize. The space to space market, goods and services produced in space for use in space, drives a lot of investment, it drives a lot of excitement, but it's really the space to Earth market that is driving the ROI. So space is extremely tangible, and when people realize how to make space data and satellites and other things work for them, they get more interested in the industry because it feels more local. I have a bit of a loaded question for the panel. I know it's loaded, but I'm gonna throw it out anyway. So many companies that are currently engaged in space or want to become involved in space really have to balance this shifting duality of stakeholders. So even if you are completely commercially funded, the government is still either a customer or a regulator in some capacity. And so Brendan, I'm going to start with you, and then if anyone else wants to jump in, but what advice would you give to companies to being able to balance the duality of these strategies? Because having the government as a stakeholder and having a commercial entity as a stakeholder is a very different world.
Sure, yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and it's something that we talk to a lot of startups, and we see a lot of slide decks, and that's something that pretty much everyone is thinking about. I think to boil it down, I would say do not ignore the potential and the insights that can be that can come from working with either the DoD or NASA. I think they're fantastic resources. Obviously, they have significant funding available, and they could be a great partner, especially when you're trying to cross over the valley of death that so many companies experience in their middle rounds. But also just as a knowledge center and as experts who have, walked the walk and talked the talk for decades, we have seen so many companies that have really benefited from leaning into that experience and not being afraid to say, hey, we want to partner with the DoD earlier. We want to lean into that experience. I think that anytime we talk to a company and they say, oh no, we're going to be totally commercial. We don't need the DoD. We don't need to work with NASA. We're going straight B2B. We kind of look at each other and we're like, well, that's good luck.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I mean, I think you want to take advantage of these opportunities to work with the government for these public-private partnerships. I think there's a lot of good that can be done there. And I think at the same time, you want to be careful of the use cases. To get to that point of what's the end user want. What the government wants might be different than the private sector. And so I think being careful of how far you go down one road and what that means for selling to other parts of the sector is something that I think is this interesting tension that's still there and still being worked out.
Yeah, and I fully agree, and I think from a technology and capability standpoint, virtually all of the subsegments of the space industry have the potential to be dual use, commercial and defense. And so what is that secret sauce or that dividing line that causes a company or an entrepreneur to say, I'm going to do defense or national security, I'm going to do commercial? Oftentimes it's what they know. It's the relationships they have, it's a business development, it's contracting. It's not the technology, it's not the capability. So completely agree. I think both sectors should be in the heart and mind of all space companies. And the question is, how do you get to market? How do you talk the talk? How do you do the contracting? And if you know one or you know the other, then recruit talent that knows how to get into the other.
I have one other thought on that. I think just thinking about the government opportunities as well, the other thing I would add is there's so much kind of new opportunity that's coming up, new ways of doing things, that I think the government itself is also working through how do we leverage these. So the other thing I would say to some of these new companies and with new products is be proactive about working with the government, right? Don't necessarily just wait to see if they ask for the type of thing you have, but actually go and show how your product, how your service can provide value, right, to the public.
Yeah, and just on the flip side of that, I think the world we're entering into now poses a real challenge for policymakers and people who are trying to incentivize these companies and support them, but at the same time, you don't want to skew their activities so much and make it so that they're so focused on you as their anchor customer that they can't actually go off and build on the infrastructure and everything and go out and compete in the competitive market, which is what we want. I think that NASA and the DoD wants to create a strong, robust space economy, be one customer among many, and reap the rewards of the space economy that hopefully we're building. But it's a two-way street. It's hard for both sides.
Yeah, and I've also noticed too that, I mean, this is true across every sector and every industry, but people are only limited by their knowledge set and experience. So from the government aspect, a lot of times, sometimes they don't necessarily maybe know that technological capability is at a point of fruition where it is able to be adopted or inserted. And then Justin, to your point, and I'm wondering if you could touch on this a bit, but what I've also seen in that business strategy, being able to talk to both parties, is sometimes young companies, when speaking to investors, will want to see if the government has validated them, either through giving an SBIR something, right, funding, because it shows that there is some stamp of approval that the government either could be a future customer or is interested. Have you experienced that in the investment world?
Yeah, absolutely. SBIRs and other types of programs like that are considered non-dilutive capital, right? So it's maybe better than raising equity. It does provide a stamp of approval. The trap is if you're pursuing SBIRs or programs that have nothing to do with really your target. Where are you taking your company? What is your strategy? Make sure that these opportunities aren't taking you off of that track, because I've seen that happen frequently as well.
I do want to shift a little bit to the investment side of things and looking at the future snapshot. So there's been lots of talk, and we've illuminated here that there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of excitement around space, but we need to bring it somewhat pragmatic. I feel like a lot of companies can sometimes get caught up in the altruism of what space can bring to bear, but understanding what that actual framework looks like, roadmap, and having a practical insertion point. And the evolving, we've discussed earlier, there's really been this evolving macro landscape of what the M&A community and investment looks like. And so I'm curious if you can give a snapshot of current activity and a way to think about it.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So it helps maybe to provide a little bit of context. So if we were to go back, say, a decade or so, there was very little investment in space, right? This is all a phenomenon really over the last decade or so. In fact, in a former life in 2013, we held the first, at the time, venture-focused space conference called at the time New Space Investors Conference. And that first day that we held that conference, I was frankly concerned, is anyone going to actually show up to this event? And sort of much to my surprise, we ended up with a standing room only crowd. And if you fast forward to circa 2018-19, I think that the sector had finally caught the attention of numerous investors, both venture capitalists, high net worth individuals, family offices, corporate investors, CVCs, and so on and so forth. And what really changed was the availability of what I would call free money in 2021. And if you look at the amount of transaction activity, whether M&A, early stage venture investing into the space community, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was a rocket ship, no pun intended, in terms of the amount of investment in M&A activity. And so now as we're sitting here in early 2023, I can look at it and say, okay, well, the financing, the minority financing investment activity in Q1, it was down roughly 50% from the peak in the first half of 2021. Does that represent a lack of enthusiasm for space? No, not at all. In fact, quite the opposite. It is a shifting macro environment. It's affecting any number of industries, particularly those that are technology oriented, particularly those that have risk attached or capital intensity. And so that shift is, I think, largely a healthy thing, and it's the natural sort of rebalancing of where capital is allocated. But fundamentally, the interest in space and space investing is in many ways never been better for the companies that are well deserving of that capital.
Do you think the shifting landscape is also a shift in the risk appetite of investors?
Yeah, absolutely. In an environment where interest rates are rising, sort of a risk-off environment, there are any number of places to invest capital, right? And space is one. It happens to be my favorite, but there are other things that you can invest in. And so there's a secondary issue as well, which is these companies, many of them are capital intensive. So if you invest $10 million today, if that $10 million doesn't get you a viable constellation or product or launch vehicle, whatever it may be, then that $10 million is not money good, right? You need to be able to raise the 10, to raise the 100, to raise the billion, whatever that case may be. And so there's been not only this shift in risk appetite, but also I think a little bit of pullback from investment in capital intensive businesses, and space happens to typically fall into that bucket.
And a follow-on to that, and I'd love to hear the other panelists' viewpoints on this as well. You wrote a really interesting point in the TSR where you were talking about, and you used Virgin as an example, but essentially talking about how we're kind of past the era of hype in a lot of ways. And for a lot of these companies, it's one thing to be able to talk about the promise of your technology, but we really have to start getting down to tangible ROI in 3, 5, 7 years. And so how do you help companies think about showing that?
So, I mean, the backdrop is a pretty impressive one. You literally can't imagine a day without space today, right? So you've got that. I think that's an important grounding point I would make. But where the rubber meets the road, it's about finding product market fit, whether that market be in the national security space and what the needs of the U.S. or its allied nations are, whether it be in the commercial side of things and finding customers that really have a pull, demand signal for your product. I think that's fundamentally what it's about, is finding that appropriate product market fit.
Yeah, I'll just build on that. I think that that poses a unique challenge for this industry because historically that is not something that you really had to think about if you were going to operate in space. You were building a piece of technology that came from a requirement that was written by a government agency or something like that. So I think that is one area where it's a challenge for space companies today, that you have greater pressure to get to revenue, and if you can, revenue or get to profit earlier. But on the other hand, I do think this is an opportunity to learn from other industries who that's always been their experience. Most other industries, I mean, that is just what you have to do to operate. You have to know who your customers are and then go after them and build a product that they want. I think that ultimately if we treat this as an opportunity, that could really be a healthy thing to bring in the knowledge and experience from other industries and how they operate.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I would just add, I think there is this question about how much of the space sector and space entrepreneurial sector is unique and we have to treat it a little bit differently or give it a little more time, or be more open to government being a major customer, right, which is not always the entrepreneurial concept for a lot of areas. So I think one of the things I kind of think through is, how much is that the case versus how much do we still, in the space sector, have lessons to learn from the broader entrepreneurial community and the way it's been done in other sectors?
My last question before we get to hear from the audience, and it's open to the panel. If you could all get out your crystal balls for a second. So looking about 5 years out, what do you think is going to be probably the most profound lesson we will learn? So this could be a trend that you see that most people aren't preparing for, something coming down the pike that might hit us hard, anything.
All right, I'll give 2 parts. So I think one thing that's going to be exciting to watch and where I think there might be surprises is the applications. So tied to some of the things I said earlier, but we have that foundation now, we have the data, we have the connections, and now I think it's going to be about how do we use it, right? And all these different applications that people come up with, and that's where you'll see exciting new things happen. So that's one. And then the other one that I watch really closely is the space environment itself. And I think this is what's happening with space debris, what's happening with the amount of space traffic, and how is that going to impact the ability to continue this growth or create opportunities for new types of solutions. So I think those are the 2 things that I'll be really watching.
Sure, yeah, I think one thing that I'm really excited about that could happen in the next few years is that I think just like every company today is in some sense a technology company, I think companies of the future in some sense will be space technology providers or users. I think that's something where we're going, and the more that we can bring about new exciting capabilities, the faster that can happen. We actually wrote a piece in the Harvard Business Review saying your company needs a space strategy now, and it was trying to send a message to the non-space community saying, hey, space is doing some incredible things. The folks in this room and at this conference are doing some really incredible things. There continues to be a lack of awareness or sort of a mythologization of space where people feel like it's hard and it's separate and it's up there, and if we're the CEO of Kellogg's or Caterpillar or one of these major kind of non-space companies, then there isn't a place for us in the space economy. We do something differently. I hope that in the next 10 years, we can bring the capabilities and awareness that can make a crack in that.
And maybe lastly, to me, it's the most exciting thing is what we can't predict, right? If you go back to Steve Jobs with the introduction of the iPhone, who in any panel would have predicted 5 years later what that meant with the mobile economy and what we're all doing with the devices in our pockets today. So I'm most excited about the unknown. I think there's amazing things to come, and we don't even know what those are yet.
I agree. The rapidly changing landscape is definitely keeping us all on our toes because it's causing the government to create new practices, to do work with commercial companies. It's causing commercial companies to change business practices. It's very exciting. And I do also agree with the space adjacency piece, because I think that more and more when people do self-select in and start to realize they're part of this ecosystem, it'll continue to build much more broadly. Well, that's all that I have for you. And Leslie, I'd love to hold it over to you.
Okay, thank you all so much. We do have several questions. The first one is from Dr. Goodman at Goodman Technologies, and she asks, the future space economy is estimated to be someday a $10 trillion economy, a complete ecosystem. So besides STEM, there are enormous opportunities for many job disciplines. Where do investors see the greatest need for us space companies to hire?
If we look at the here and now as far as more anecdotally, right, the micro view, when I'm talking with clients and prospective clients and relationships, it's the engineering talent that's probably the most in demand. It's hard to find people that have some level of experience. Now, fortunately, I think the excitement about the space is driving a lot more people into the field than ever before. Anecdotally, I like to refer to the NASA t-shirt test, which is you can go practically anywhere now and see the prevalence of people wearing NASA t-shirts, and that wasn't the case 10 or 20 years ago. But beyond that, it's like any other sector of the economy. You need finance people, you need business people, you need sales people, you need people across all the disciplines. And if we're to build this space economy to trillion, multi-trillion dollar levels over the next decade.
Okay, let's get to some more questions. This is someone who's looking at his portfolio. What's an investment opportunity you believe in that you think most people would disagree with?
Where those secrets.
That most people would disagree with?
I don't think most people would disagree with this, but I think that people are increasingly aware that launch is a tough business and that it's really what you're putting in space that generates the value of a company as opposed to the vehicle itself. I think there's growing, and that's not a hot take, but yeah.
I think one thing I'll add, which also potentially isn't to disagree with, but a different way of thinking about it. I think that from an investment stance, sometimes people get really wrapped up. We talked about the altruism of what space brings to bear, so people think about asteroid mining and these other elements, but there are some really fundamental technical challenges that still need to be proven out. So how do you mine things in space? How do you drill in space? How do you control energy in space? We take outlets for granted. So how do you power things in space? So a lot of these core technological backbone pieces that aren't the most exciting, but they are really relevant to build the future, are areas that are good to look at.
And I'll say again, I don't know if people would disagree with this one or not, but I think some of the really interesting investments in the near future might be in space companies where a lot of customers won't even know it's a space company. Right, where they're going to integrate that space data or that space capability so well that you're just going to get the product you want or the information you want, and you may not even realize space's role in it.
Okay, our next question. Currently, the lunar economy is driven by government dollars for clips. Is there a path for it to become a freestanding economy on its own?
So I'll say the slightly optimistic. I think yes, eventually. I think that there could be a path that could lead that way. There's certainly a lot of excitement, and there's a lot of commercial capability that can be leveraged to achieve government goals in a more efficient way. I think that's the stage we're in right now. I personally think it's probably going to be a while before it's a self-sustaining activity, not mostly related to government goals and things, but I think we could get there. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is not an immediate term horizon, but with assuming that launch costs and availability continue to improve, and assuming that the infrastructure to sort of benefit from the lunar economy continues to develop, I think it's bound to happen. The question is over what time horizon. And there are companies that are moving ahead today and that have some interesting opportunities ahead of them.
One thing I want to add, just to put a little bit of a twist on this, is that we often hear economies in space described this way as government versus commercial. When's it going to happen? I think the way we think about the space economy generally and sectors of it is that it's a geography. I mean, it's talking about government versus commercial economic activity is like talking about in space is like talking about government versus commercial economic activity in South America or something like that. It's like there's a role for both, and the world, as long as we are doing things as humans in space, there will be a role for both in perpetuity. I think the trick is how can the government create incentive structures and programs that allow private industry to move into the spaces where we want that. We want competition. We want people to be providing value-added services, and then where is the government always going to be focusing? So those are things like public goods and areas where competitive markets just don't supply.
And the last thing I'll add, I agree with all that. Beyond the technological progression, what we really need to start thinking about is the regulatory environment. So when you have these activities happening where there's properties in space and mining in space and others, what does that regulation look like, which is a big question mark. Our
next question is from Wiley Barnes at Colorado State University. He thanks you for the great dialogue. I think we all do. But his question is, with increased demand for space capability and capacity, how should industry and universities change their collaboration in R&D and workforce development?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I have an answer ready. I mean, I think it's just finding the right types of partnerships. And I think there's excitement on both sides, right? I think people realize that there's a lot of potential in the upcoming workforce. And, I get to work with students every day, and, their level of excitement and energy is amazing, and it's infectious, right? And I think making sure that we're fully leveraging that, right, and giving those students a pathway to get involved, whether it's the engineers or, a broader set of capabilities. Yeah, I mean, it is a really key thing. I think it's just setting up those pathways.
Okay. We may want to start with Justin. We have a specific request, but I know there's expertise across the panel. What sectors of the space economy do you believe are overfunded and which are underfunded? If you were a VC right now, where would you be spending your time?
Well, overfunded, if this is a rearward-looking view, right? Is one such sector is launch, and it's not to say that launch is not important. It's not to say that many of these companies that have been well-funded aren't on a path to significant success. But at the same time, it seems like for the last few years up until pretty recently, literally every week there would be a new launch company that would be formed, and quite a few of them receiving significant investment. So that's an area that I think has been overfunded. Ironically, I'm looking at that or defining that in the aggregate. Within that, there are some launch companies, who shall remain nameless, that have been underfunded, right? So it doesn't mean it's an efficient allocation of capital. It just means that launch as a sector has gotten probably overweight in terms of attention over the last few years. Conversely, until very recently, I would say some of the downstream capabilities to exploit and leverage space-based capability. So simplistically, I'd call them maybe software companies, but the companies that can actually exploit space-based data, information, capability, those have been, until pretty recently, overlooked.
Yeah, just to add on to that and maybe generalize a little bit more, I think that a tick that we have as people in the space industry is that we all want to go after the really sexy problem, which usually means doing something around hardware in space. And that's great, we need a lot of that, but I think that when you look at the real economic value, what it takes to create and retain value, there's a lot of untapped opportunity downstream and especially in software. So one thing that I've been encouraged to see is people subspecializing in very specific areas that maybe are less sexy, like creating platforms to help simplify the engineering process, just create certain standards. That's not the same level of excitement maybe as creating a mega constellation in space, but I think it could be just as valuable.
Okay, let's see if we can squeeze a lightning round, a couple more questions in here. Do you think there will be a significant commercial in-space services market within the next 10 years?
Yes.
Yeah, also yes. I mean, I think there's still more technological advancement that needs to happen, but I think the basic concept and some of the initial capabilities that are already on orbit are proving that there's demand for that and that there's value there. So I think that's coming.
2 thumbs up. How many startups could crash due to interest rate inflation and market instability in 5 years?
Well,
Exact number.
I don't know numbers wise, and I'm not even going to attempt to quantify it. This is a lightning round, so to be quick, I think the question is how many of them are going to run out of money? That's the real fundamental question. And not 50%, but I would be surprised if it were not a meaningful double-digit percentage.
Yeah, I'll just add as far as perception, I'd be curious to hear your take on this, but my perception is that from people who are seeking fundraising now is that good ideas still are getting funded. It might be a little bit harder and people might have to temper their expectations, but I don't think this is a red light for people looking to go for their next round or enter the space industry. There are still a lot of good ideas, and if you look below the headlines, there's a lot of people getting funded and getting the runway that they need to keep executing.
Okay, one more question. Which firms are most impacted by the tight space labor market, and what should be done to expand the workforce pipeline?
So I'll say I don't think we have great data to give. So there might be kind of anecdotal answers on where we're feeling that that tightening or that difficulty in finding people the most. But I think one of the challenges in tracking the space workforce is we would really like to see data collected on a more fine-grained level. So we could get at questions like that. You know, what's really happening down in the details of the space workforce. So I think that's a little bit of an unknown. And how do we attract more people? I mean, I think some of the high-profile, exciting things that are happening in space and in commercial space, we didn't get that launch this morning, right? But you know, those types of things, I think they're causing people to pay attention, right? And I think there is, you know, as that continues to grow, I think that is helping to bring in more people and will continue to do so.
Yeah, just a specific challenge that I've heard is that people will get their next round, they'll have this war chest, and then all of a sudden they're like, we need to hire X number of people like right now, and that can be a real challenge. So any company that just secured a round, congrats, but also good luck with finding the many, many talented people you need.
It's going to take time. It takes time to build the right skill sets. And so in the meantime, people who have those capabilities and those skill sets, we're seeing competition, which means increases in salary, increases in comp to attract them. In the end, that's in the short term kind of a zero-sum game, but over the 3 to 5 year plus time horizon, it's happening.
And I think for the workforce of the future and really creating that pipeline, it comes down to information, education, and advocacy. Getting students, you know, K through 12, university, however, interested in space, but also to understand how their background, skill set, and interest applies into space, so that they can self-select in early and get the skills and the training they need to become part of the workforce. And I want to thank you all for being a wonderful audience. You know, as we have these discussions, they're critically important because we're all building the future together. And as you can see, there's data that support and there's a lot of pontification. So thank you for being part of it. And there is another discussion in this room that starts at 2 o'clock, which will be a really great discussion from our Space Matters panel if you'd like to stick around. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.